Hello, everybody. Hello. All right, so I thought a lot about how to do this. There's an amazing woman that I respect and revere that is coming out to have a conversation, and I hope to answer questions because there's a lot going on in our country right now. I don't know if you all heard, it's only been a couple months, but we have a new president. I don't know if you know that. But as I was going through my Twitter feed this morning, I saw why I wanted to structure it this way. I saw somebody tweet out, you know, South by Southwest going political. And I want to sort of have a conversation before we sit down and hopefully answer questions from anybody who wants to ask about anything. But I want to have a conversation that you might not expect to hear from someone who now is in the United States Senate. I just want to have a conversation with everybody about the issue, the concept, the most powerful force, I think, in the universe, the force that has shaped and guided our country to the moment we are now, and that is love. I am one of these people that really believes that we are all here today as a physical manifestation of a larger conspiracy of love. That ordinary Americans who took extraordinary steps in seeing each other, in valuing each other, in sacrificing for each other, and struggling each other. And the love of Americans has shown, as it's evolved, the ability to leap space and time, to leap obstacles, to span differences. And we are a nation that was not founded because we all look alike, spoke the same language, or prayed alike. And in fact, we know we've had ugly divisions in our country, fearsome conflicts, but there has been a spirit that has still found a way to reach beyond that and to manifest a glorious, triumphant love. One of my favorite moments in American history is when a president who could have, at a time of division and separation in our country, when he spoke to the nation, his inaugural address, where he could have given into a dark vision of our country, and it would have been true. He could have accused the people who were opposing him of some of the worst of human character, but he chose not to. He said these profound words: with malice towards none and charity towards all. It was Lincoln's second inaugural address, but the moment that inspires me is that he went afterwards to a reception, and there was tons of people obviously trying to get at the president. And the historical accounts that I've read said he was being pulled this way and that. The governor of Rhode Island was trying to see him and all of this, but he kept pressing to find someone who he referred to as his friend, which in itself is amazing because these two men fought bitterly and angrily over substantive issues of life or death. And this friend that he was looking for was a black man who almost didn't even get in because of the powerful, anguished lines of race in America at that time. But he was recognized, and someone took this man and brought him in as a black man in a presidential reception after a inaugural address. And Lincoln is pushing to find his friend and being pulled different ways, but he's looking for this black man, finds him, and this black man, regal in stature but humble in spirit, literally says to the president, as it's recounted, please attend to your other guests. But Lincoln had a mission. He wanted to know something. He wanted to know from this man what we all do when we get up and give speeches or talks. Hey, how did I do? You know, he literally said, I want to know what my friend thinks of my speech. Now, this would be the last time these two men would ever speak to each other. This would be the last time these incredible historical figures would have a moment. And they looked at each other, and I'm sure there was a pregnant pause as this black man named Frederick Douglass looked at the President of the United States and simply said, Mr. President, it was a sacred effort, a sacred effort. I believe in many ways the hope of our nation actually does lie with many of our historical figures and how they acted in times like this. I'm not one of these folks that wants to whitewash our American history and eliminate the ugliness and the bigotry and the sexism and the hate that was prevalent in our history. But the power of our history is that despite that, we seem to have chosen a harder pathway of love despite the hate and divisiveness of our days. Look, our founding documents are saturated, unfortunately, are seen, replete through them as examples of those darker strains of human nature. Native Americans are referred to as savages. Women aren't referred to as at all. Blacks are, Stokely Carmichael used to say, constitute. I can only say 3/5 of the word. But if you look at the spirit of our founding documents, literally go to the Declaration of Independence. I always say, read the very end. What was the climactic appeal in the Declaration of Independence? It's a declaration of interdependence, this understanding that's seen in that wonderful African saying that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. It's this idea that we need each other, and we have to make an unusual and extraordinary commitment to one another. Even though we don't necessarily pray alike or look alike, we have to make an unusual and extraordinary commitment to one another for this country to make it. And our founders in this document, this profound writings by Jefferson, end with a declaration of interdependence. He says at the end, we must mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and that word again, our sacred honor. I think that this is a problematic use of words when Americans appeal to this ideal that we should be a nation of tolerance. I think that's really problematic if that is the aspirational ideal of our society, because it is a rejection of that larger goal that we have, the more difficult goal, which is to be a nation of love. I tolerate a cold, okay? That's not what we were called to do, is to tolerate each other. We are called to love each other. Now, patriotism, which is love of country, I think mandates a love of one another. We don't have to like each other, we don't have to agree with each other, but tolerance says I'm just gonna stomach your right to be different, and if you disappear off the face of the earth, I'm no worse off or better off. But love says I see you. I recognize your dignity, I recognize your value, I recognize your worth, and I know that if we're gonna make it, we have to find a way to exalt that truth within one another and find ways to connect, to be together in a larger mission, a mission larger than ourselves. Tolerance builds fences between people, love rips them down. Tolerance crosses the street when someone else is coming, and love confronts and embraces. Tolerance says that I don't need you. Love says you are essential to my well-being. Tolerance says I don't have to care about what happens to your child. Love understands that if your kid gets health care and an education and thrives and becomes an artist or a doctor or an entrepreneur or an inventor, that I am so much better off, therefore I am invested in who you are and what's happening in your lives. Now that is this understanding that to me, now more than ever, is so critical, is knowing that we have an obligation to one another. Knowing that we need to pledge a deeper, more sacred honor. And what bothers me is, while I am a big proponent and lover of technology and innovation, I am not a lover of the separations that are becoming easier and more convenient, where we can create our own virtual bubble around our lives, where we literally are no longer seeing one another and understanding our need for one another, and it's becoming even more convenient to have confirmation bias and to begin to believe I am so right and you are so wrong. There is a lacking of that humility, the heroic humility that I talked about in that first story. And not seeing each other creates a very dangerous reality. I mean, the brilliance of people like James Bevel and Dorothea Cotton, who in May of 1963 challenged Martin Luther King. These young innovators challenged Martin Luther King and said, look, what you're doing here in Birmingham is not working. We need to create, my words, not theirs, but a virality to the media that we have. We've got to figure out a way to get the message out so people see us. And so instead, they convinced King to change his tactics. And actually, as Taylor Branch, I think the chapter title is called The Children's Miracle. They convinced Martin Luther King to let kids march against Bull Connor. And suddenly you have 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 13-year-olds and 18-year-olds marching against Bull Connor and his dogs and his fire hoses. And the media, before not paying attention, suddenly swarms into Birmingham, Alabama. Now people from Iowa to the Soviet Union are seeing on TV and running on front pages of newspaper the horrors going on by fellow Americans, and we who have reservoirs of love and strength and dignity and a heroic, courageous empathy, reservoirs of courageous empathy that we don't tap into. Suddenly people were confronted with what was happening to their neighbors, and they were so offended by it that they swarmed in to Birmingham, and within days, segregation fell. The power with which, when we rip down our convenient bubbles and see each other and recognize that dignity and worth and see another suffering, that is empowering. It helps us to tear down the walls of injustice. When I was in my 20s, I was a Yale law student, and I followed the call of that great American prophet named Chris Rock. And he said, why is it often the most violent streets in many cities is named after the man that stood for nonviolence? And I moved on to Martin Luther King Boulevard in Newark. Now, if you know Newark in the mid-90s, King Boulevard was a great testimony to Martin Luther King, from our best high schools like Arts High to great universities, all on King Boulevard. But the south end of that street was off the hook. And I moved on to it, and I just saw the problems and the challenges. Some might call it the American carnage. It was violence and challenges and poverty and a crack house. I mean, so much was going on, but I'll never forget the wisdom. I always say I got my BA from Stanford, but my PhD on the streets of Newark, because there were tenant leaders that grabbed me by my scruff and woke me up and reminded me that the world you see outside of you is always a reflection of what you have inside of you. And if you're one of those people who only sees darkness and despair and problems, you can't make a difference. You can't be a change agent. But if you're one of those stubborn people who every time you open your eyes, you see hope, you see opportunity, you see love, then you can elevate the world to that vision. And one of the great leaders at that time was a guy named Frank Hutchins. He ran the longest rent strike in Newark's history back in the 70s. By the time I met it, he was an aging man, slowing down, but he and I and other tenant leaders, some of the best fights of my life were in that neighborhood in Newark, New Jersey. The slumlord of the buildings I would eventually move into, these what became public housing projects. I lived there for 8 years, battling it out. The slumlord was convicted in federal court for crimes. We were doing great things. It was such an affirming moment for me, but I'll never forget the early days sitting in the basement of a tenant meeting and having people go on and on and on. And I had all I needed for the complaint that we wanted to file, but yet the tenant meeting kept going on, and everybody seemed to want to get a microphone and talk, and I was restless. But I'm looking at this Zen master, this black elderly man that just would look at people, and it never looked impatient. The love in his eyes spoke volumes. And I said to him later, I said, man, that was a long tenant meeting. Why? We could have cut it off. And he's like, no, Cory. This is not just about a legal complaint. It's about the affirmation of dignity. It's about seeing people. It's about tearing down walls, giving people the opportunity who so much of this world ignores them and the reality they experience every single day. Frank got older, and I became a city council person, then a mayor. He got sicker. Eventually, he had a condition where he lost his eyesight, and I would come see him, and I'd say, hey, Frank, I'm Cory, and he would sort of dismiss me and say, I see you, and then we would go on. And he couldn't see me, but he said it. I couldn't believe this heroic man who tens of thousands of Americans owe their housing or their hot water. This man's champion, but it killed me that this great hero in America was poor. I would take him out to dinner and to go shopping, and he would implore me, let's go to the movies. I'm like, Frank, you can't see, man. And he'd be like, no, I want to sit, man. I want to hear the sound. And I would take him to movies. And eventually he got older and older, and he was my hero. When I passed the bar, I didn't call my mom first. I called Frank first. My hero, I watched him get older and eventually sick, eventually in the hospital, eventually in hospice. And my ego that thinks adulation might be the sign of greatness, this guy challenged me to understand that service, not celebrity, that purpose, not popularity, that's the greatness of life. But I sat with him. In his final days, the day I showed up at the hospital, where the nurses told me this is gonna be it, he will die soon. I walked in and he could barely talk. I sat with him, I kissed him, I practically climbed on the bed and just held this man. And that last visit, he said only could get two things out, only two things out. When I walked in the room right now, it's, hey, Frank, it's Cory. He looked up, he heard my voice, and he forced out of the words, his breath was short and rapid, but he forced the words out. He said, I see you. And then when I was leaving, I kissed him again on the forehead, and I said, Frank, I love you. And he said those words, forced them out, I love you. I left an empty hospital room, an empty hospice room, a dying man. I walked out and he would soon die. And as I was struggling to prepare for his funeral, I just thought about his last words to me. I see you, I love you. I see you, I love you. I see you, I love you. This is what we need. This great mentor of my life. I see you, I love you. I'm one of these people, I love faith, I love religion, I've studied many of them, but I'm the first person to say, wait, before you tell me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people. Before you tell me about the passion of your faith, show it to me in your compassion for others. But we Americans, we share a civic gospel. We say words over and over, liberty and justice for all. We say in songs and ideals we've written into our founding documents some of the highest principles of life, but they mean nothing, nothing at all. The paper they're written on has no value, dust in time. The way they live is by people who embody that spirit and understand that we indeed now more than ever must pledge to each other our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor. We must give a sacred effort to cut through the divisiveness, to show a courageous empathy, to leave the geographic ideal of neighborliness and be there for our neighbor that might exist on Martin Luther King Boulevard, on a Native American reservation, in poor Appalachian town. They are Americans, we are Americans, and we must see each other because that is the beginning, the necessary ingredient to the greatest force in our country right now and our only salvation. And that's to love one another. Thank you.
So, get to talk to you on these comfy chairs.
Yes.
So I was very moved by by your words around love. But I want to push back a little bit.
Please.
We have seen more hate crimes, right, against Jews and Muslims and people of color playing out over the last few weeks. There is a ban on refugees who have been tortured and terrorized. Our trans children are being stripped of their rights and protections. And every day we are hearing of immigrant families who are being deported. And there's a lot of anger, a lot of fear. And so when you talk about the importance of resisting, but loving resistance, I really want to understand, what does that mean? What does loving resistance mean against this backdrop?
So let's, first of all, you were a force on these issues before the time of Trump. And you and I sort of, I know, have a common spirit on this, which is the injustices you just named. There were outrageous, egregious injustices going on far before the time of Trump. And if you go to a community that's poor in America or a community of color and ask them about the larger society in which we live, hate crimes have been going on with chilling regularity. You know, I can talk to Muslim and Sikh Americans who clearly might have seen hostility increase, but were enduring insults and enduring bigotry for a long time. If you just talk about, and you and I on our last public conversation, just talked about the outrageous injustices going on within the criminal justice system, which, I mean, we do things every day in America that other countries, NATO countries, industrialized countries, look at us and go, we are doing things that they call torture in their country to our children in prison systems. That we have a nation that takes the vulnerable, the most vulnerable, the mentally ill, the sexually abused, the addicted, and our most common response to their life experiences, and I mean this, and I fact check or challenge me, but one of the most common responses to their life experiences is to throw them in jail. And so I often, when I hear this sort of people activated during the time of Trump, you know, I go home to a community where the median income is $14,000 a year, where people are experiencing things every single day where that are outrageous to me. I mean, they radicalized me in the sense of how can we be so comfortable as a nation when this kind of darkness underbelly goes on, where in one sense we proclaim to the world that we're the land of the free, but only 5% of the nation, but 1 out of every 4 imprisoned people on the planet Earth are in our country. And again, overwhelmingly people of color, overwhelmingly poor people, overwhelmingly sexually abused people, and so forth. And so I hear all these conversations that have sprung up in the last 2 months about all these outrageous things are going on. And I want to remind people that these outrages have been deep in our society for a very long time. And I'm happy that folk are getting woke to a lot of what's going on. But I always feel it's important to put that point in. Now to your larger question about how do you respond to hatred, and you and I were talking backstage about a healthcare bill that, to me, forget economics. I can make an economic case why this bill is going to cost all of society more as people have lack of access to preventative care, that it will actually, for those people on the far right, that attacking Planned Parenthood is actually going to increase by the hundreds of thousands a year more unplanned pregnancies, which is going to increase the number of abortions in our country, which even the CBO says it's going to cost us about $130 million over 10 years more just in paying for aspects of what it means to have an unplanned pregnancy in America. So I can sort of tell you the policy issues, but to your specific question about how do you respond to hate with love, I mean, to me, that's the only thing that's ever really won. You know, King says that darkness cannot, banish darkness. Only light can do that. That hate can't drive out hate. Only love can do that. But the reason why I counter the way I do is what still bothers me, sticking with King. I'm actually not as bothered by, I shouldn't say that. I'm deeply bothered by those things, offended, angry. But what has worried me over the last 20 years of my sort of professional life is what King says, even more condemning than hatred and bigotry. He says, what our generation will have to repent for is not the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, it's the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. That is the compelling threat to me, is how unaware we are of the suffering of
it. Let me share a story with you. So the day after the election, my daughter comes up to me and she says, you know, Mommy, I don't know what it means to have a president who doesn't love me and want to take care of me. And that changed me, right? It changed me in terms of thinking what my responsibility to her is to always feel strong, right? Regardless of our politics. And I'm wondering, what has happened for you since the election that you feel changed by?
So, I mean, I definitely was shook when I saw a man who never lied to the American people in terms of who he was. And what I mean by this is, I mean, this is a guy who has brought mendacity to a new level in public discourse. But in terms of a campaign that began with a demeaning and degrading of Mexicans, I mean, the very beginning of that, of Mexican immigrants into our country who have lower rates, about half the rate of criminality that Americans themselves have, but he was targeting them as being rapists and criminals. So his coming down the escalator, boom, opening note of his campaign, I'm going to demean and degrade people. And then the entire campaign demeans and degrades a federal judge because of their ancestry, demeans and degrades women and minorities and Muslims, and went through. I definitely was shaken that someone like that can continue to be elevated time and time again to become president-elect. And by the way, he becomes president-elect and his rhetoric doesn't change. I went out of respect for the presidency and President Barack Obama and President Bush and President Clinton, all who were sitting on that dais, I was going to sit there as well. But even listening to him describe our country, I mean, I had a throbbing headache when I went to bed that night. And so I want you to know that what's changed about me is, I think all of us should say, how did this happen? And Trump is not in my opinion, the instigating force or the catalytic force or the igniting force of all of this. That we have to understand that things like this happen when people disengage from politics. And I'm tired, and that's what if I didn't only have 140 characters, I really wanted to respond to that, like, is South by Southwest going to start with politics? And why do we have this sense that, first of all, politics is separate and apart from our lives? Everything we do is an expression of the polis, the decision we make on the food that we eat. This fabric, how do you get a $5 t-shirt? That is endorsing systems and being complicit in systems. And so, you know, Governor Chris Christie is actually somebody that is a friend. I can write a dissertation on our disagreements. I mean, but I always tell the story that when I watched him get elected, the year before, exactly 1 year before, it was an Obama election. There were lines around the polling place. When I went to go vote, you know, I love my city and I love my state. Everybody's so nice and genteel here in Texas. But in New Jersey, we keep it real, you know? And so I go to vote, I roll up to the end of the line, and I rolled deep when I was a mayor. I had police officers and, you know, I was trying to, you know, just make a statement. And I rolled up, and the woman in the line just looks at me and shakes her head, and she just goes, not what a historic day, not how wonderful. She goes, don't you think you're cutting in line now? I think I got 3 snaps. I don't care who you are. You're waiting just like the rest of us. You ain't special. And I was like, ma'am, okay. And I waited. 1 year later, no line. It's a gubernatorial election. I walk right in, poll worker there, I hug her because she looked lonely. And then that night, similar to me of the Trump, because I know that our elections have consequences. And I watched the returns. Christie barely edged out the Democratic governor, and then boom, people start coming up to me and saying, why is the governor cutting funding to Planned Parenthoods? Why, he said he would raise taxes on nobody, but hey, the earned income tax credit got cut. So taxes on the lowest income New Jerseyans went up. All these things happened, greenhouse gas agreements we pulled out. And people said, why are the Republicans doing this to us? And I'm like, the Republicans didn't do this to us, we did this to ourselves. So if there's anything that I've changed, that's changed about it, is I'm doing everything I can to try to not focus my energy on those folks who are expressing currents within our culture that are despicable. I think we have an obligation to condemn them. And you and I talked in the back that I've not seen in my lifetime a climate of fear in our country like now. Sikh Americans, Indian Americans, gay and lesbian. In Montclair, New Jersey, which we joke and call it the People's Republic of Montclair, a brick thrown at the window of our state office for Garden State Pride. 20%, we had an article in our state newspaper, 20% less revenue going to some of our local stores in immigrant neighborhoods in places like Newark, because people are afraid of leaving their homes. People with American children or American spouse are afraid of, have done no crime. So I definitely am hurting. I feel a sense of pain about my country right now, and that the person that is going to be most watched has not backed away in any way from the level of rhetoric that he's giving. But I really think it's a message to all of us that we see the truth of our society, that if we do not engage, if we do not participate, then we are the source of the problem, not necessarily that elected official we don't like.
That's right. So I want to talk more about this issue of engagement, right? And since I'm from Google, I have to think about it in terms of engagement in the context of technology. And I'm a human rights lawyer, right? And I've been amazed at how, because of technology, we have changed the conversation, for instance, around police brutality, right? So a conversation of police brutality that usually just happened in Black and brown communities now is a public discourse in a way that is unprecedented. And that's because of our smartphones, right? Those smartphones capture video of police brutality, and then that video is shared on global platforms like YouTube. So I think about that. I think about how tech has changed a human rights conversation like police brutality. And then I think about how Black Lives Matter started as a love letter, as an online love letter to the Black community. Or how the Women's March began as a Facebook post, right? And so there are all of these powerful examples of bearing witness to human rights violations, all of these examples of civic participation and movement building because of social media. And then there's this other side, right, of how there's also no question that social media has had a corrosive effect on the civic discourse. And so I wonder, where do you stand with this? Like, what is your thinking around, has tech and has social media made us better citizens, or has it coarsened our level of discourse?
You know, I think about this a lot, and I talk whenever media folks come to, you know, I sat down with somebody from the Atlantic recently, and I want to interview them more than I think they might want to interview yet another politician. And I often ask them about that. How is things changing from you? Is this hurting the ability for Americans to get information, objective information, and the like? But I just think that social media, like TV, like all these new technologies, are neutral platforms, and that that those platforms, the power of those platforms is going to be determined by who engages with them and who uses them. And we've seen how television, we've seen how the radio could be used for really despicable things. I mean, Father Conklin was, I see us, every generation sort of having their great demagogues, Father Conklin of his time, McCarthy, and people listening on the radio to his demagoguery. That if the platforms are ceded and surrendered to those forces, they're going to use them and pervert them and undermine them. But if people who are activists are finding ways to use technology, to embrace technology, they can be powerful forces for good on the planet Earth. You refer to yourself as a human rights lawyer. I only take issue with that fact because I think the totality of who you are is powerful. But here you are, and this is why I have to give a lot of love to Google, in such a position within a tech company and such a vision for how you use that technology. It's only amplifying your ability to impact on issues that matter. And so the reason why I told the story in my opening remarks about Martin Luther King when he came out of Birmingham jail, where he wrote this profound letters to the Birmingham jail, which I think now more than ever everyone should read. It's very short, but they found a way to use media of the era in a way that would explode. And look, the ability with all the noise for creative artists and activists to use media, I think is something that is, I'm just excited about, and I'm leaning in now more than ever. I see often more valuable than a speech on the Senate floor. A lot of the videos I'm putting up on Facebook and Twitter right now, just sitting in my office explaining policy to people on Facebook. And while the C-SPAN audience, no disrespect, but the 14 people who might watch me on C-SPAN, and my mom makes 15, when we can get, I think my last video got something like 1 million views. So I think this is an essential tool for activists and artists. And it's an essential tool to restitching our society, because I do think we've seen a lot of fracturing. And for somebody, first and foremost, for African Americans not to feel alone in this world is really powerful. To let people know that I'm standing with you. I ran to the Dulles airport when I heard what was going on there, and that there were even American citizens being detained, green card holders being detained, that there was a court order that was ordering the Customs and Border Protection to allow them to have lawyers. It wasn't being enforced. To me, I thought as a constitutional crisis, the executive branch was not obeying the legislative branch. So I went there as a United States Senator with the court order to try to challenge the Customs and Border Protection. But I was so stunned by the crowd that it was a packed area of the airport waiting for Muslim people coming off the airport. They were cheering for Muslim folks, and I saw people wearing kippahs. I saw people of all different colors, and I know that that was a social media call that allowed that to happen. And so I know everybody, it goes back to what I was saying about the tenant leaders who taught me about the world you see outside of you. This has been some of the darkest moments of my professional life, but they have also been the most inspiring moments where I've love in a way I just lifts my spirits. And so much of that is being sourced by our connections on social media.
So, so there is this kind of hopefulness that you feel, as opposed to, our President Obama talked about the risk of these bubbles of thinking, right, that are insular and unexamined. Do you have that fear that there's also that kind of impact that's playing out?
Oh, I do. This was the conversation I had with the Atlantic reporter, where I really do worry, including myself, that I'm sorry, when I go home at night and I'm just feeling like I need, some spirit, I turn Rachel on, because Rachel gets me charged up again, and excited. But then I have to remind myself that I don't want to just listen to people that tell me the things that source me and excite me and say, yeah, I want to try to turn over to Fox and watch what fellow Americans are consuming. I want to turn over to PBS, who's going to give me a lot more news, because there is a planet out there beyond America's borders. And then I want to try to, like I was talking to my staff today about me feeling a little, that all these videos I'm doing, how can I have not done a video yet on what's happening in South Sudan or what's happening in both South Sudan and Yemen are about to be declared famines, which is something that there's a very high bar to know what's happening to millions of people. So I feel two things. One is a worry, like you said, that we are all creating a world around us where we're just hearing from each other and drawing those lines. But I do think I feel an obligation to try to be one of those people that crosses over those lines. Like right now, I had to make a tough call. There's a conference called AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, which is a fiscal conservative, mostly attended by Republicans. But I had an incredible experience the last time I went to that conference in connecting with people and working to find that common ground. And so this is what I think brings me to the important point, which is if people want a society that is more loving or more compassionate, but let's even go further than that in which we don't have these bubbles, I try to say this to myself, so I'm not preaching to other people, but for me, nothing is going to change unless I do. If I'm not embodying what I want to see in the world by removing myself from those bubbles, if I'm not doing that every single day and understanding that every one of us, no action is ever done in vain, no matter how small. When you purchase something, it's a small act, but you're complicit in supporting whatever it is, from industrial agriculture to low-wage workers, but small acts done for love and for grace and for kindness that it ripples out into the world. And so I just try to myself say, okay, before I criticize something in the world, like nobody cares about what's happening in Yemen right now with 3 million displaced people, with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of children in food insecure and on the brink of famine. Well, unless I start talking about it, then nothing's going to change. So this important mantra human mantra that Gandhi made so perfect, in that you've got to have a larger obligation to be the change you want to see in the world. If you want hope, you've got to be an engine of hope. If you want love, you've got to be more loving. If you want more light in the world, you've got to ignite yourself.
Indeed. So I know one area where you have really fought for grace and connectedness and bipartisanship is in the area of criminal justice reform. That you have really been a abiding, committed presence around the insistence that we have to end mass incarceration. So, right, under a Sessions-led DOJ and a Trump presidency, what are you thinking? What is there to be had around criminal justice reform and ending mass incarceration?
Yeah, I just feel a little awkward because everything you were saying about me, I really do believe that what we say about the world is more of a reflection of who we are. The world and others is more a reflection of who we are than the person we're criticizing or complimenting. You are an amazing activist within this space. And again, to see you at a company like Google and you have not compromised any of your values, your righteously strident work in areas like this, I'm just one of those people that's really grateful, and you are waking people up. Look, Senator Sessions was my colleague. Senator Sessions and I had a good working relationship. Senator Sessions and I passed a piece of legislation to give the Congressional Medal to the marchers who marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. This is how much I've worked with him. But when I knew he was going to be Trump's choice for the most powerful law enforcement position, not in America, perhaps the planet Earth, I knew that I had a moral obligation to get any forum I could to speak out against his being the United States Attorney General, because I knew I knew his history, I knew what issues he stood for, I knew how hard he fought against bipartisan criminal justice reform. And as a guy who has lived the incredibly stark difference we have in America of having two entirely different justice systems, one for if you're rich and one for if you're poor or struggling in America. We have two different justice systems. As a person you and I both respect, Brian Stevenson says, in America we have a nation that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than poor and innocent. And as a guy who grew up in a predominantly white, relatively affluent town and community, and watched me and my friends, I'm a senator now so I can't say me, watched my friends break laws regularly. Um, so drug laws. And I mean, on senior cut day at Old Tappan High School, you know, 4 of my friends went to go buy alcohol. The place was closed. They kicked open the door, stole cases of beer. And, you know, again, we all did stupid stuff, and usually we got caught doing it, and nothing happened in their lives consequential. They're all, and by the way, that's probably the right outcome, because these are great guys now, making good livings, raising families. But then living in Newark for the last 20 years, and it didn't take me sort of long, even though I had worked everywhere from East Harlem to East Palo Alto, but when I was living in Brick Towers and watched how kids who were doing things that the President of the United States, at least 2 of the last 3 presidents, Bush and Obama, didn't admit to doing a little marijuana. They copped to felony drug use. Mm-hmm. And so if you understand that there are more African Americans now tied up in the prison system than all the slaves in the 1860s, and that the overwhelming majority of them are getting caught up for non-violent drug offenses, and when you see a kid in my neighborhood, 17 years old, doing something that, again, Congress people have done, but as soon as they get caught up, they don't even get a trial for months. They can't pay bail, again, because we have a society organized right now that if you're wealthy, you can pay your bail and get out. Well, $1,000 is unattainable for people. So now you're stuck in prison, you're missing school. Kids who are arrested, forget convicted of anything, their dropout rates go tremendously higher, especially if you look at that cut by income. And then in prison, what's happening to you while you're waiting your trial? I mean, we now are starting to hear more about the story of Khalif Browder, which is a kid who was accused of stealing a backpack that spent over 2 years in Rikers. And I went out to Rikers, and again, I was elected in Newark, and was stunned when the kids started telling me they had been there 6 months and they hadn't even gotten their trial yet. That just destroys their lives. So I guess what I'm saying is, people don't accept this fact that when these things are happening, it is the people versus so-and-so. It is the state versus so-and-so, and that is us. And so to see this jaggedly different, nobody stopped and frisked people coming home at Stanford from a frat party. No FBI investigations were going on to let's break the pot ring at Stanford University. I mean, I mean, there are people literally using their smartphones to get their Adderall or the X, and nobody's doing anything about that. But the investigations going on in poor neighborhoods all over this country that's disproportionately affecting African Americans, that now has us in a situation in Florida, that so-called swing state, where 1 out of 5 black people can't even vote because of felony disenfranchisement. This is so unacceptable to me. So you take a guy like Jeff Sessions, who is speaking out, fighting us, fighting his own party. The Koch brothers even support dramatically lowering mandatory minimums and other reforms. The outlier in the Senate in the Republican Party, and he didn't just criticize the efforts to lower mandatory minimums and to take away this outrageous reality that most Americans don't even know that our criminal justice system is no longer trials and juries. 98% of criminal convictions now are plea bargains because you have prosecutors with so much power. I've had children sit with me and say, they said to me, either I take this plea or they're going to move me to adult court and I'll face 20 years, or take a plea for time served, just get out and all I have is a criminal conviction. Well, that criminal conviction doesn't let you get a Pell Grant, doesn't let you get food stamps, doesn't let you get business licenses, you can't get hired by Burger King in Newark if you have a nonviolent drug offense. And so for Jeff Sessions not only to be fighting us there, but then fighting police accountability. At a time we have hundreds of thousands of Americans, and even the head of the FBI talking about the problem we have in America of implicit racial bias in policing, that there's no difference between blacks and whites for using drugs or dealing drugs, but we now know that if you're black in America, in fact, young whites have a little bit higher rates of dealing drugs than young blacks, but if you're black in America, you're almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for it. So with even the head of the FBI saying that, the Obama Justice Department investigating Ferguson, investigating Newark, and Jeff Sessions speaks out against that. Private prisons, I visited one last month. Stock went way up under this president. Jeff Sessions embracing what's going on in the private prison industry and supporting this. I can go on. It is someone that is so working against the common good. And unfortunately, unless you are living on the margins or one of those woke people enough to say, you know what, I live in a comfortable community, but let me read Just Mercy. Let me read the new Jim Crow. So at least I understand what millions of my fellow Americans are facing, not every year. If you are a young black person in America, your parent, as mine did, told me that when you go outside and you're driving, the driver's license conversation I had with fear in my parents' eyes, this is the daily reality for African Americans, and that's casting no shadow over the great law enforcement of our country. But it's just a reality for what African Americans, especially in poor communities, are dealing with, or Latinos in poor communities are dealing with every single day. So, you know, I broke Senate tradition. I took a lot of incoming for doing that. But if we are silent in the face of injustice, we are complicit in that injustice. And I will always raise my voice.
I think there's so much gratefulness to you for refusing to be silent around injustice. But I want to talk about another form of silence that I see. You know how I feel about this.
Yes.
There's a lot of silence around the fact that our women and girls are also behind bars. And in fact, tomorrow there's going to be a forum that the National Council on Formerly Incarcerated Women will be doing to say that women and girls are also subject to mass incarceration, that women and girls are also suffering, that, as you know, I've talked a lot about, we shackle mothers behind bars at the point of labor and delivery, that most women behind bars are there for reasons related to sexual violence, that with our girls who are bought and sold for sex, we arrest as child prostitutes, even though most of them are not of the age to consent. So there's silence around women and girls and what happens to them around criminalization. What can we hope to see around also not being complicit with that silence?
So, you know, creating community is such an important thing, and I just feel blessed to have you in my life. And this is, my chief of staff is backstage, he's about to probably lose it because we're not ready to announce this yet, but your passion advocacy for this, because I always stand up and I talk about it. And I've had this one woman who comes to a lot of my speeches who has started heckling me about, you never talk about women. I sort of, thanks to the community of activists, really became more woke to this issue, and unbelievably stunned about the large percentage of women that are in prisons, and especially in jails. Remember, all the data I've been talking about the overwhelming imprisonment in our country. Right. Most people forget we have 9 times the admissions of, in jails than we do in prisons. Jails are people who are overwhelmingly there before they even get their trials and stuck there. But first of all, this is an incredibly large and growing group, but that large percentage of women have been victimized themselves, or survivors, I should say, of sexual abuse. And so one of the things that I've started working on in partnership with some incredible women that I get to be, it's really, there are times that I'm like, I can't believe I'm getting a chance to work with these folks, but people like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, and to their credit, a lot of us, we're talking to Republicans as well, but we hope in the coming month to put a bill out about the treatment of women in prisons, addressing many of the issues that you've been talking to me about for so long. So thank you for influencing policy.
That's great to hear. So we're supposed to go to these questions.
Yes,
and I don't know if I can see it, but it says from the audience, will you be running for president? Please say yes.
So my snarky response to this often is, I'm running from the president, I'm not running for the president. But that's not true. That's not true. So this is the mistake I think we all make, and which is we sometimes focus more on position than purpose. And And so I think that senators make a mistake if they start thinking about positioning themselves for the next election they have, or especially for a higher political office. Like, I'm going to use an example. I think our food policy in America is tragically broken, and that we are, as a nation, subsidizing, your tax dollars are being used to subsidize a broken food system, a broken large corporate food system, and then you have the same government using your tax dollars to try to tell people not to eat the very foods that we're subsidizing. And by the way, that not only are we losing taxpayer dollars there, but then we lose taxpayer dollars because we're making everybody sick. And so I'm freely going out, and like, one of these things, I don't understand how the beef industry, for example, gets our tax dollars that they use to advertise beef. You've seen the advertisements about, you know, beef, or the pork industry. With your tax dollars are going to that. And so that's not necessarily a thing you're going to hear somebody saying who's thinking about it in an Iowa primary or what have you. And so I'm here as a United States Senator who never really planned to ever in my life get here, but I was a mayor who was just very much focused on sort of what the challenges were for my city. So I don't know what the future holds, but in this time in American history, I want to be a fearsome truth teller. And I'm very upset that you have kids all over America who walk into a bodega and they can get a Twinkie-like product less expensive than an apple because we're participating in those kind of things. So I don't want America to be focused, and again, being the change you want to see in the world, let's not focus on 2020. Let's focus on right now and what we could be doing to tell the truth about the injustices that we're surrounded by.
Okay, so how do you suggest turning digital activism into on-the-ground activism? How does the internet help or hinder social progress? That's a great question.
That is a great question. And the one below it, I hope we can get to as well, because that's a really good one, this word deregulation. But look, why do we see them as separate, right? You know, I ask everybody, I challenge especially young folks to pull out their smartphones and look at their last 10 posts or the last weeks of posts on pick your social media platform, and ask yourself, do they reflect my highest self, my best values, my ideals? Am I being an agent of social change? Am I sharing articles, sharing information? Because I now know as a political scientist, having looked at these things with data, that the most powerful influence you have for me as a politician is not my TV commercial or the mailings that I send you. It's actually the most powerful influence I have are on my circle of friends, and maybe 2 degrees out from that. But we all have that power. And so I just tell people not to divorce your life. Be involved as a digital activist, but please in your life, do actions of real activism in your life in a real way, not just a virtual way. And that doesn't have to be going out and attending a rally. It means volunteering at your soup kitchen, being a mentor. That's an act of political defiance as well, doing things like that, and then posting about it, frankly, and it ignites other people to do the same.
Okay, so the next question is, what is the right balance of regulation and deregulation when it comes to spurring technological innovation, from driverless cars to supersonic flight?
And I love that question, because I'm really living in this space right now and finding a lot of bipartisan work, because I think that we have a government that is not moving at the speed of innovation, that we have a government that's actually strangling a lot of innovators with overregulation. Now, I'm a Democrat, and I often bristle when I hear the President of the United States arbitrarily saying, for every new regulation is toxic and bad, and every new regulation that's introduced, I'm going to make them cut 2 regulations. Well, what regulations have they cut so far in the first 2 months of the Trump presidency? Well, they've cut regulations to stop mentally ill people, and I never want to in any way cast shadow on that, but these are folks who said that they can't even need people to work with them to even handle their own money, but now we're going to let them buy guns. And by the way, the current regulation as it stood didn't ban people from buying guns. It created a process by which they had to go get them. I can go through the regulations they've rolled back, which are horrifying to even, I think, Trump base voters if they walked through what was happened. So I'm not this person that just thinks that we need to get rid of all regulation, but I will say this, and I can pick an industry. like the drone industry in America. The FAA had such a horrific sort of strangulation of innovation in the drone area that you just started seeing the best innovation move to Europe, and the best innovators move to Europe. I told the head of the FAA, if you guys were around during the time of Orville and Wilbur Wright, we would have never gotten off the ground here in the United States of America. And so when we have a government that is so far behind on technology, where the only way to get information out of the Senate these days, if you want to find out, the Senate is not a searchable database. You have to order PDF files, for crying out loud. We are so far behind. Even the procurement laws in the government, you can't work with a small tech company. What you have to go through with a small company that could provide incredible value to government, you have to go through incredibly difficult areas. So I worry now, and I'm actively working, that this country is being left behind on everything from next generation nuclear energy, which is so exciting and so removes so much of the danger out of it, that nuclear engineers are literally going to China or Russia or other places in Europe and leaving the United States because we are not a fertile ground for nuclear energy innovation. The same thing with driverless cars I worry about. The same things with biologics. We've got to be a country that continues to be the greatest net exporter of innovation. And we've got to be a country that has a government that is poised to be a catalytic agent for innovation and doesn't suppress it with needless burdensome regulations.
I think that's right. That's right. Okay, so how do we listen to and love those that voted for Trump, for those that are openly sexist, bigoted, and in doing that, change their minds and open their heart?
Okay, so I just think, first of all, never give safe harbor to bigotry or sexism or racism. And in fact, we all need to check people every day when you encounter it. And just by calling out a friend who makes a remark that is hurtful or mean, and sometimes we feel socially awkward doing it, but I've become so much of a better man. I've been so much of a better heterosexual because of people checking me in my life when I just said things that are wrong, hurtful, and reverberate. So a lot of times people think, okay, that person's spewing hate on the street corner and tells, like, and I've saw this in a Trump rally, when this guy was screaming at a black person, "Go back to where you came from." And I'm thinking to myself, is that Mississippi or Louisiana? Like, how far back are we going to go here? But remember, a lot of that is not giving it safe harbor within your own lives. Right. But the second thing is, we have to understand that so many people have legitimate anger about a system that is no longer what it was during my grandparents' time, where people are watching their kids not get the same bargain that they did. Their wages in this country have been stagnant for 20 years, where the kids are coming out of college with debt that was unimaginable just a generation ago, where they've seen their job options and prospects disappear, where they work a time and a half, but they're still making $2.13 an hour, where their kids are getting sick and they can't be there for their kids because they don't have paid family leave. There's so many things that are legitimate angers and frustrations. The problem is that creates an environment where demagoguery and fear-mongering can tell you, well, it's Muslims' fault, or it's Mexicans' fault, when really your jobs, 80% of factory jobs have disappeared in America that have gone away, were not the Mexicans, it was the microchip. And so we have to, if you are not addressing that anger and that frustration and listening to it and understanding and legitimizing it, then you're going to create an environment where it can be exploited. And so what I say is, I really try to, in fact, there's a very famous news outlet that's talking to us now about going and sitting in a diner in Trump Town, and me as this black Northeastern Democrat, and just having conversations with people who are red state folks, because I can sit down with a Republican and find so much common ground. I get people on Twitter saying, I don't agree with you on just about anything, but I really like the way you engage with people on Twitter. And I sit back, it's like name the things we disagree on. Like, I believe that we should be trying to lower the rates of abortions in America. But I might have ways of going about it different than you are, like don't cut Planned Parenthood. But there are conversations we can actually have And I think we should look for those commonalities, because in America, if we continue to shine lights on our differences and don't do the harder search for our commonalities, we're going to further break apart our nation and undermine our ability as a country to do the big things.
That's right. That's right. So, thank you, Senator. I think your willingness not to curse the darkness, but to fight for light and justice is really powerful. So thank you for sharing your words with us today.
I just want to say a thank you to you as well. I just think that you are a person of grace and more important, that consistency. And I think that getting up every day, and sometimes it's hard. I think that often the greatest courage in the world is not roaring and fighting the big battles. It's just getting up the next day, putting on your shoes, and getting out the door for another day of loving. And when I meet you and get the best hug I've had in a while backstage from someone who is so purposeful, it really means a lot. And I think that if I could ask anybody to look you up, Google you, and see more about your background, but the one thing I want to give a sort of, I think something I've drawn from you that is something that's important for life, and I hope everybody understands this, is Alice Walker said the most common way we give up our power is not realizing we have it in the first place. Indeed. And just to stay with Alice Walker, because she wrote this great book I know you read called In Search of My Mother's Garden, where she said the real, and it was actually a chapter called, I think, The Black Revolutionary Artist. Now, you and I are not necessarily, I don't know if you are, I should say, I can't carry a tune, or my handwriting even is bad, not to mention drawing something. But I like this idea that Alice Walker has of thinking of ourselves as revolutionary artists. And the advice she gives to revolutionary artists, which you embody, which I think we all should take, and that is she simply says, the real revolutionary is always concerned with the least glamorous stuff, with raising a child's reading level from 3rd grade to 4th, with helping someone fill out food stamp forms, because folks got to eat, revolution or not. Right. The real revolutionary artist is close enough to the people to be there for them when they are needed. And for us to remember that wisdom, which is there are massive things going on in this world, but you and I both know we're here because, at least for me, my family, somebody took my dad in, one boy, when he was struggling and his mother couldn't take care of him. It's those small acts in history that resonate, and you live that every single day through your goodness, your decency, your mercy, your justice, and I thank you for embodying that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.